Hi, I'm Alana Hippensteel from Pharmacy Times. Today I'm speaking with David Silverstein, a partner in Axon's Intellectual Property Practice Group and FDA practice groups, on the implications of the White House potentially waiving intellectual property protections for COVID 19 vaccines, changing the United States' original position on this issue. This announcement comes as the pandemic continues to rage in India, one of the original countries that called on the World Trade Organization to suspend vaccine intellectual property protections to increase vaccine production. So, David, what does White House support for waiving intellectual property protections for COVID 19 vaccines mean? And are there any immediate changes occurring in light of this support?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on your program again. It's a very important topic, very timely topic. Since October 2020, the WTO has been considering this extremely broad proposal, as you said, by India and also South Africa. And I think what's missed in a lot of the headlines is it isn't just about patents. The scope of the IP that they're seeking to waive under TRIPS are, are patents, but also industrial designs, copyrights, protections of undisclosed information, so in other words, trade secrets, and and the scope of technologies that are implicated is much broader than merely vaccines. It also extends to R&D activities, manufacturing, supplying of medical products, um, so therapeutics, personal protective equipment, even COVID tests and medical devices. So it's very broad, unprecedented in scope, frankly, in these sorts of proposals. And until last week, the United States was a staunch opponent of this proposal. At this point, it's largely a symbolic gesture. In order to be adopted at the WTO, consensus is needed by all member states. And so, as far as immediate effects, it's more of a ripple effect on the policy front that this has created. It's not going to create, a run on vaccine technology overnight.
Right. That's interesting. So, what does this support from the US potentially mean for global support of the proposal put before the WTO?
Well, it's part of that, consequence of that ripple effect. It sends a strong shift, a strong message that the United States has shifted its policy stance, and in an effort to help the international community tackle this pandemic. I think the rest of the world was very surprised when Ambassador Tai reversed course last week, announcing the Biden administration's support. Up to that point, there were about 60 co-sponsors
Mm.
to the proposal out of 164 member states, and so those are mostly from developing countries. Um, and the opponents were key countries, in addition to the United States, from the developed world, such as the UK, including the EU, Japan, Switzerland, Singapore, South Korea. Since then, since the United States has shifted its stance, what we've seen, at least publicly, is a softening of the rhetoric. Like Angela Merkel's administration came out and said, while they don't support the proposal, they're willing to discuss. Whereas I think what we saw in the headlines, at least, 2 weeks ago, was a staunch, this is dead on arrival, we're not willing to entertain it. So there's a bit more discussion we had. Um, I think that's going to change the dynamic as the member states, negotiate this. Another thing that's may not be readily apparent to people who aren't as steeped in this is that this is the start of a negotiation phase that will take several months. And much like any domestic legislation, there is going to be a lot of log rolling and give and take of, the starting point is extremely broad. I guess, from what the developed world is signaling, they're willing to discuss, but they're no doubt going to require a winnowing of the scope of this.
Interesting. Yeah. Would the action of waiving IP protections need to be a global effort in order for it to actually work in assisting other countries in their vaccination efforts? Or could this be a decision that the United States could do individually in order to have those ripple effects like you're talking about?
Hmm. Well, I think so. To start with, at least like copyrights, patents, so that um, the well-defined IP, setting aside trade secrets that are within the scope of this proposal, those are territorial. And so the United States, even outside of this, could enact what we call march-in rights. So they can say within the United States, we're no longer going to allow the enforcement of certain patents, certain copyrights, if you will. That would have an impact on the ability of manufacturers within the United States, third parties, to make their vaccines and export them, and they wouldn't be blocked by the owners of those patents. What effect would that have worldwide? Certainly not. It wouldn't have the effect that the proponents of this proposal would hope. So for that, I mean, you could block, say, an AstraZeneca patent in the United States, but if AstraZeneca has similar patents in India, good luck importing it to India, unless India also does march-in rights or waives the IP there. And you'd end up with a patchwork system where in some, you'd effectively, lower the IP barriers to getting vaccines in some countries, but not others. It'd be very hit and miss. It certainly wouldn't be as blanket of an effect as this proposal to WTO.
Right.
But it's kind of a loaded question in that it's hotly disputed whether waiving IP protections is at all necessary in order to assist other countries in their vaccination efforts. It's been extensively written on, and I've spoken on it a number of times as well. The patents are not the real barrier to manufacturing and distributing these vaccines. They're much deeper issues. There's issues with, I think last time we spoke about cell and gene therapies on your program and the host of complexities that come with those products that just aren't found with small molecules, for example. And it's definitely a play here. Even if you gave the blueprints, the secret sauce, and the recipe of how to make these vaccines, you can't just port that to a third world country and say, knock yourselves out, make as much as you want. You need specialized equipment. You need specialized specially trained personnel. You need access to supply chains. And so that's in mixed in with this dispute of whether this is really advancing the ball of getting more people around the world vaccinated or not, is what is the follow-on effect of if we create this gold rush of newcomers to the vaccine space to rush out and hope to make this, they're scooping up crucial ingredients that are needed for the current manufacturers to make their vaccines. And frankly, we're already seeing a bottleneck in vaccine manufacturing capacity, and so it could exacerbate that. So there's a big debate over whether it's necessary at all to get most people vaccinated.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and it does kind of change the conversation around this discussion posed to the WTO. Um, in regards to the IP protections issue, why do you think there has been a shift in thinking around IP protections for vaccines, specifically in the United States? And could this potentially have broader implications for something like this occurring again in the future with other vaccines?
I think really what it comes down to is politics. We are starting to get the virus under control here. Unfortunately, demand for the vaccine is dropping off, especially in the face of increasing manufacturing capacity of vaccine here. And so it's I think it's natural for our political leaders to sort of start turning more and more of their attention towards what can we do in other parts of the world.
Mhm.
I mean, the reality of these pandemics, you can't just get the pathogen under control in your country and ignore and bury your head in the sand. Because what'll happen is, and as we're seeing, it'll continue to be transmitted from person to person in these other countries.
Yeah.
And with every transmission comes the chance of mutation.
Okay.
And with mutation comes the chance of new variants forming and even vaccine resistant variants. And so it's natural, I think, for the politicians to say, okay, now that we're sort of getting our feet under us here, let's do what we can to keep it from returning to our shores. Let's snuff this out in other parts of the world. But I think it's a sort of natural evolution of the political landscape.
Fascinating. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, David.
My pleasure.